Usually when we talk about taking a test, there's this comfortable expectation of predictability, right?
Definitely.
You study the material, you sit at a quiet desk, the questions are exactly what you're prepared for.
Yeah.
And, if you get a passing grade, you're certified.
Right. It's a very clean process.
Exactly. It's a clean process.
Yeah.
But that illusion of competence, it is violently shattered the moment reality actually sets in. The test you have to take looks absolutely nothing like the one you studied for.
Not even close. Yeah.
So today we are tearing apart a highly critical, incredibly intense analytical article from the Valortec firearms training blog. It was written by a veteran instructor named Herfel, published on July 23, 2026, and it carries the title, Meriden Police Shooting Exposes a Training Failure.
Yeah, and the author, he takes this single, just harrowing incident and uses it to peel back the layers of how armed professionals, and really citizens too, are trained in this country.
Right.
Exposing what he considers to be a systemic, fatal flaw in our whole definition of readiness.
And before we get into the details, I want to make our mission for this deep dive crystal clear to you, the listener. We are exploring the uncomfortable, often overlooked gap between a legally justified use of force and actual practical firearms proficiency. And I want to stress, we are completely impartial here. We are not taking sides on political debates surrounding gun control, and we are certainly not here to debate the broader politics of law enforcement.
Yeah, that's not what this is about.
Right. Our sole mission is to examine the mechanics of this author's intense critique of how firearms training is actually conducted in America today. Okay, let's unpack this. Because the article centers on a specific event, and we really need to understand how a single terrifying event on a suburban lawn can unravel the entire concept of how we define readiness.
It really is a powerful starting point.
It is. So I want to lay out the factual groundwork from the source to start us off. The article takes us to July 19, 2026, on Sagamore Road in Meriden, Connecticut. Officer Anthony Offiaeli responds to an active domestic violence scene.
And he arrives alone, which is a huge factor.
Alone. Exactly. What he finds is 38-year-old Robert Lee Jenkins III actively striking a motionless man in the head with a baseball bat.
It is a completely nightmarish scenario, truly the worst possible moment of human violence.
Yeah.
And it's one that requires an immediate, lethal response to prevent further loss of innocent life.
According to the preliminary report cited in the article, the officer ordered Jenkins to drop the bat 4 separate times.
4 times?
Right. Jenkins ignored the commands and just continued the attack. At that point, the officer fired a shockingly high volume of rounds. Public reporting based on Officer.com Bodycam reviews estimated that nearly 20 rounds were fired in rapid sequences before Jenkins finally fell.
Wow.
Jenkins died at Hartford Hospital from multiple gunshot wounds to the torso, and the assault victim he was attacking died at the scene from blunt force head trauma. So the author of the article makes a very pointed separation right at the beginning. He praises the immense, undeniable courage of the officer who literally ran toward an act of murder to stop it.
Which, is undeniably brave.
Yeah. Exactly. But he separates that bravery from the tactical execution. The shooting is entirely legally justified, but firing nearly an entire combat load raises incredibly serious questions about proficiency.
It does.
It's like a driver in a completely justifiable car crash. Say they had the right of way, someone swerved into their lane, the law is completely on their side. But as analysts, we still have to ask, did they hit the brakes efficiently, or did they lose control of the wheel, match the accelerator by mistake, and skid across 3 lanes of traffic?
Right.
The legal right to act doesn't automatically mean the mechanical action was performed perfectly. The author uses this striking phrase. They say, the law may authorize the shot, it does not excuse the miss.
What's fascinating here is how the author challenges the defensive mindset of the entire training industry. Because when a chaotic shooting happens, the immediate reaction from many instructors and departments is to just wait for the legal ruling.
Right, the DA's office.
Exactly. If the district attorney says the use of force was justified, the book is closed. But the author calls that intellectual dishonesty. True support for law enforcement, or anyone carrying a firearm for that matter, means demanding tactical accountability. If an officer has to fire nearly 20 rounds to stop a threat at close distance, and potentially many of those rounds miss the intended target, that is a mechanical and systemic failure.
A physical breakdown, basically.
Yeah, it reveals a breakdown in the physical interface between the shooter and the weapon under extreme duress.
And if a trained officer struggles with shot accountability in a real-world scenario, we have to look upstream at how they are actually trained. Which brings us to the author delivering a blistering critique of what he calls qualification culture.
Yeah, he really goes after it.
He does. Now, for anyone who follows this space, you know what a static, flat range looks like. But the author's point is that these ranges actively build negative training scars.
We do.
In a static qualification, the paper target is completely stationary. The shooter knows the exact distance, they know exactly how many rounds they will fire, and they get Pavlovian warning, usually a beep from a shot timer, before they even have to act.
Yeah, and often they even get to warm up first.
Right, they are training for an administrative exercise, not a fight for their life.
The firearms industry, according to the text, protects this massive lie by pretending these static qualifications somehow equal combat readiness. And the science explicitly proves why the static training fails under pressure.
Let's talk about that science.
Yeah, the article cites 3 distinct pieces of research. First, a study from Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam showed that anxiety fundamentally reduces shooting accuracy by altering a shooter's visual behavior.
Let's break down the mechanics of that, because it's not just a vague sense of being nervous, right?
No, not at all.
Under extreme stress, the body experiences a massive adrenaline dump. The sympathetic nervous system kicks into overdrive, pushing blood to the major muscle groups for a fight-or-flight response and pulling it away from the extremities in the eyes.
Right, and this physiological shift literally changes the shape of the lens in your eye.
Wow.
It causes tunnel vision, where you lose peripheral sight and the physical ability to shift focal depth. In a gunfight, you need to quickly shift your focus from the threat to the front side of your weapon and back again.
Constantly refocusing.
Exactly. The Amsterdam study proves that under sudden, intense anxiety, your visual processing system degrades to the point where tracking your sights becomes incredibly difficult unless you've trained specifically to overcome that biological response.
I mean, my brain completely shorts out if I have to do simple mental math while the barista is waiting to my order. I can't even imagine trying to process the background trajectory of a projectile while someone is actively swinging a baseball bat at a human skull.
It's an immense cognitive load.
And you also have to think about muscle memory under stress, like a computer's RAM. When your brain is running a massive, high-stress program like stopping a murder, it has no RAM left to consciously think about how to grip a tool or align your sights. If that grip isn't hardwired into the hard drive, the whole system crashes.
Which brings us to the second piece of research cited, this one from PubMed, involving 27 police officers. This study proved the concept of state-dependent learning.
Okay.
Practicing under induced anxiety improves the ability to maintain accuracy when real pressure is applied. Conversely, officers who only trained in calm, static environments experienced severe performance degradation when stress was introduced.
So if you only practice in a controlled, sterile environment, your brain has literally no neurological roadmap for how to execute those motor skills when the adrenaline is flooding your system.
Precisely. And the third piece of evidence from Sage Journals drives this home. They compared static shooting to dynamic shoot-house exercises. As the exercises became more representative of actual confrontations incorporating movement, unpredictable targets, and spatial awareness, hit percentages dropped significantly while heart rates spiked.
Here's where it gets really interesting, and I want to push back on the author's absolute dismissal of qualification culture for a second, because we have to look at the logistical reality of what is being proposed here.
Sure.
Isn't a controlled qualification at least a necessary baseline? You have to learn to walk before you can run. If we adopt this rigorous standard where we fail students or officers who cannot perform under simulated combat stress, we are talking about potentially disarming massive portions of patrol officers nationwide. The logistics and the manpower crisis that would cause seem like a nightmare for any police chief.
The author anticipates that exact administrative panic, actually. To quote the text directly, "A qualification card is a receipt. It is not a guarantee." Yeah. The author's counter-argument is that the environment of a lethal encounter does not care about police staffing shortages or a department's training budget. Stress isn't some unexpected complication in a defensive shooting. Stress is the actual environment the training is supposedly preparing you for.
The environment itself.
Right. If your training doesn't include the stress, you are quite literally not training for the job. You are just checking a box for liability purposes.
Okay, so if static training leaves a shooter entirely unprepared for the massive adrenaline dump of a real fight, how does that manifest when the trigger is actually pulled?
That's the terrifying part.
Right. This brings us to a really grim part of the article, the physiological reality of terminal ballistics and this dangerous myth of the instant stop. There is a pervasive expectation, almost entirely fueled by Hollywood, that a handgun bullet possesses magical stopping power. The bad guy takes one shot to the torso and instantly drops to the ground.
Right, but physics and human anatomy dictate otherwise. Handgun rounds, unlike high-velocity rifle rounds, they do not carry enough energy to cause massive hydrostatic shock or temporary cavity tissue damage that incapacitates a body instantly.
They just don't have the power.
Exactly. A handgun bullet essentially just pokes a hole. Unless that hole severs the central nervous system, so the brain or upper spine, a determined attacker, will continue to function until catastrophic blood loss causes a drop in blood pressure, and that can take minutes.
And in this incident, Jenkins sustained multiple torso hits, but continued swinging the bat for some time before falling. Because shooters are trained on paper targets that reward a hit anywhere in a broad central zone, they aren't taught to observe the actual physical results of their shots.
Right, they just shoot the zone.
When they shoot an attacker and the attacker doesn't immediately drop like in the movies, panic overrides their training.
And the author describes this physiological panic as an emotionally driven string of fire. The shooter's cognitive loop just breaks. They expected an instant result, they didn't get it, and so they just keep pulling the trigger.
Just dumping rounds?
Yeah, dumping a magazine as fast as they can based on sheer emotion, rather than making controlled, visually processed decisions for each follow-up shot.
Speed without control is just noise. But the danger there isn't just wasting ammunition. Think of it like a lethal game of billiards.
Okay.
When you are standing at the table, once that cue ball is struck, it has a physical trajectory. You can't call it back. And you are entirely responsible for every single ricochet, every ball it hits, until it comes to a complete physical stop.
Oh, absolutely.
Only in this case, a miss in a shoot house hits a dirt berm. A miss on Sagamore Road moving at 1,000 feet per second goes through a living room window, or into a passing car, or into a neighboring house.
The text forces the reader to confront that exact visualization. The Meriden incident happened on a residential lawn. What if there had been children playing across the street? What if family members were standing just behind the suspect? When a shooter dumps 20 rounds and their visual processing is so degraded they can't even track their front sight, they certainly aren't tracking the complex background of a suburban neighborhood.
So how can a shooter possibly balance the absolute frantic urgency of stopping a murder in progress with the immense cognitive load of tracking the trajectory of every single bullet?
This raises an important question, and the author answers it by shifting the ultimate burden entirely onto the individual pulling the trigger. The text emphasizes that the shooter alone owns the projectile from the moment it leaves the muzzle until wherever it physically stops.
The shooter alone.
Right. The police department doesn't own the miss. The ammunition manufacturer doesn't own it. The instructor who signed off on a useless static qualification card doesn't own it.
Every round leaves the muzzle carrying the shooter's name, career, freedom, and future with it. That is an immense, sobering burden. It requires a level of accountability that most people simply aren't prepared for when they strap on a holster.
Because the laws of physics and human anatomy apply universally, this burden of the miss spares absolutely no one. This critique targets civilians and military personnel just as fiercely as it targets law enforcement.
Everyone is subject to it.
Exactly. The author points out that holding a civilian concealed carry permit doesn't magically confer competence under stress. Buying an expensive pistol with a high-end red dot optic doesn't make you a capable defender.
Right.
Even for military personnel, wearing a uniform or having a specific rank doesn't override the physical mechanics of controlling a firearm in a chaotic environment. The text puts it bluntly, a badge does not defeat biomechanics.
Okay, so if the current system of just checking boxes and passing static tests is fundamentally broken, what is the fix? We can't just point out the flaws without looking at the proposed solutions. The author demands a shift to what they call the Valortec standard, moving away from performance theater to genuinely science-based training.
Right.
But let's clarify what science-based actually means in this context, because it goes far beyond just shooting accurately on a flat range.
It requires analyzing how the human body physically interfaces with the weapon under extreme duress. It focuses heavily on skeletal alignment and muscular efficiency.
Okay, how so?
Well, under an adrenaline dump, fine motor skills and muscle strength degrade rapidly. If a shooter relies entirely on forearm and wrist muscles to manage recoil, those muscles will fatigue and fail in a high-stress scenario.
That makes sense.
Skeletal alignment teaches the shooter to lock their wrists and elbows, driving their body weight forward so that the rigid bone structure absorbs the recoil rather than easily fatigued muscles.
It's about building a physical platform that doesn't collapse when the nervous system panics. And it also involves training visual processing. Learning to track the front sight as it lifts and returns, even when your body wants to tunnel vision onto the threat.
Exactly that.
Look.
Furthermore, the standard demands evaluating shooters completely cold.
Cold. No warm-ups.
None. Real emergencies do not offer warm-up bays. You don't get a few practice rounds to remember how your grip feels before the violent encounter begins. You have to perform on demand, entirely cold, just like you would when waking up to a home invasion or responding to a domestic violence call.
Wow.
And most critically, this standard requires actual remediation for failures. If a student cannot consistently account for their rounds under reasonable simulated pressure, instructors must stop protecting feelings.
Right.
They cannot hand out a certificate of completion. They must either remediate the student until true capability is developed or fail them outright.
So, what does this all mean? The author drops this incredible insight near the end of the article. They say, stress does not create skill. It audits whatever skill was already there.
That's a great way to put it.
It is. An audit simply reveals the exact balance in the bank account of your muscle memory. If you haven't made the deposits through rigorous, realistic training, your account is going to overdraw the second the pressure hits. Think about how this concept of a stress audit translates to you, the civilian listener. Maybe you have a concealed carry permit and you think that a 2-hour introductory course on a Saturday morning is enough preparation to protect yourself.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the armed citizen actually operates with a profound disadvantage compared to a responding officer.
Oh, absolutely.
They do not have body armor, they do not have a radio to call for immediate backup, and they do not have an established command structure. They might be in a crowded grocery store with their children standing right next to them.
It's just you and the problem.
Yeah. If a civilian experiences a stress audit in that environment and their skill account is empty, the result isn't a failing grade on a piece of paper. It is entirely catastrophic. The goal must shift from seeking documentation that makes us feel secure to developing measurable, accountable capability.
We've covered a tremendous amount of ground today. We started on a tragic scene on Sagamore Road in Meriden, Connecticut, witnessing a horrifying act of violence and an officer's desperate, high-volume attempt to stop it.
Yeah.
We examined the anomaly of firing 20 rounds, not as a legal failure, but as a mechanical and systemic breakdown. And we followed the author's argument from that suburban lawn to a profound national critique of how America trains its armed professionals and its citizens.
It's a huge shift in perspective.
We unpacked the neurobiology of an adrenaline dump, the myth of the instant stop, and the immense cognitive load required to own the physical trajectory of every single bullet you fire.
The author succeeded in taking an isolated, chaotic event and utilizing it to illuminate our systemic reliance on the illusion of readiness. It forces anyone who carries a weapon to look in the mirror and ask if they are truly prepared for the biomechanical realities of a lethal encounter.
I want to connect this directly back to you, listening right now. The concept of a stress audit doesn't just apply to carrying a firearm. It applies to any high-stakes scenario in your life, whether it's a medical emergency, a severe crisis at work, or even just a split-second decision behind the wheel of a car on an icy highway.
Right. The audit comes for all of us.
Exactly. Are we training for a predictable, comfortable test? Or are we intentionally putting ourselves under pressure so our minds and bodies are prepared for chaotic reality? As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on everything we've just discussed about the science of stress.
Yeah, I'm curious.
The author of this piece focuses heavily on the immense physical and cognitive stress during a shooting. They argue passionately that training must simulate that terrifying environment so the physical trajectory of every bullet can be accounted for.
Right.
But if a shooter must own the physical trajectory of every single round, what about the trajectory of the psychological aftermath? If we completely overhaul our training systems to simulate the extreme, chaotic physiological realities of a gunfight, how should those training regimens also evolve to prepare an individual for the intense, lifelong psychological toll of having made those split-second life-and-death decisions?
That is a heavy question.
It is one thing to train the hands and the skeletal structure to manage the physical recoil of a weapon. It is another entirely to train the human mind to carry the permanent weight of the result. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the standards around you. Keep pushing for reality in your preparation. And we will see you next time.